Okay, good morning, everybody. Well, ciao an and magandang umaga. Selamat pagi to all my friends here. Welcome to our first of the series in the book of Revelation. Well, I want to give you a warning about this series. So it's not about the futuristic spiritual studies that you may think that this, could be. So I'm going to a more holistic approach towards understanding Revelation. So you might disagree with some of the things that I'm going to share, but it's fine. Just don't throw stone at me. I'm glad that we're doing this online, that your stone cannot reach me. Woohoo! And I'm going to approach this from a spiritual, historical, archaeological, academical, psychological perspective, okay? So I want to see what the historians, the academicians, the archaeologists have found during the time of John when he wrote this, so that we can have this complete picture about this book of Revelation. Okay, and the Bible needs to be contextualized, not contextual, contextualized from this 5 perspective, right? So you need to understand the cultural background, you need to understand the historical backdrop, the reason behind the letter, the individual personalities and perspective, the author's personality and perspectives. There is, your image, your vision of God, who to be, will set your calling in life. For instance, if you see God as a merciful God, as a gracious God, as a forgiving God, then your calling is much of a counselor, someone who will be nurturing, someone who will be caring for people. Whereas if you see God as a judge, he's going to come down and judge the world, then your calling could be that of an evangelist, someone who will go out and bring people to Christ and tell them that if they don't receive Jesus, they're going to hell. And so, it's the same with the authors of the Bible. They are like you and I, mortal. So they have their own personalities and the perspective of who God is and what God is saying. And so we've got to contextualize it from that. As a psychologist, I look into this more detailed than I guess most people. Of course, the Bible needs to be contextualized from the spiritual undertaking as well as the theological truth. So we need to understand that for all this perspective. Now, as far as historical perspective, let me just dive into, just give a brief introduction to what's going on in the time of John. Now, if you want to go into history, you got to look into their money. Yeah, money talks. Well, you see, this is a Singapore $50 note, all right? This is my money, okay, not yours. I'm just showing it to you. This is a Singapore $50 note. And there is this person, this picture, this figure, the picture of this person here. He's our first president. So give us a bit of history. Okay, this is our first president, and we put him on the notes and all that. So during the time of John, it was the time where Domitian, the emperor who came after Nero, who was the emperor of Rome, and at the time, most part of the world in that area was part of the Roman Empire. So Domitian is a cruel tyrant of a king, of an emperor. He regarded himself as king. Now John lived through this. He saw what the Caesars have done to his brother. Nero killed his brother savagely, and now Domitian is punishing, persecuting Christian. And more than just what Nero had done, Domitian claimed to be God himself. So he asked his people to regard him as the Lord, as the God. And in this coin, it has a picture of his son sitting on the globe of the universe. It's like he is God, and his son is the son of God, son of the universe, with 7 stars around it. And that could be the reference why John wrote about the 7 stars, and also about many things that he was hearing and experiencing in his time. It could be that there is a fake God. There's an emperor who claimed to be God, that John wants to let the Christian know that, hey, you got to be focused. There is a real God that's coming back for you. And so he's using code to tell the people about what's going on. So this is another coin. Use the front of the face of this coin is Domitian, and the back flip side of this coin is that of Domitian riding on a white horse. Remember the reference that John gave, that he is going to come back. God is going to come back in the great white horse. It could be that reference. There are many, many more references during the day. I'm going to dig and pick from all those archaeological findings and historians' writings about during this time and put them together in this study. So it's a very holistic approach towards this study. So who wrote this letter, where it was written, when it was written, why it was written, how it was written. And we all know that John wrote this letter. John was one of Jesus' 12 disciples. He was part of the Jesus inner circle. 3 of them were in the inner circle, James, John, and Peter. And he was a brother of James. James is not the brother of Jesus or the one who wrote the book of James. James, the son of Zebedee, and is a brother of John. Now, James and his brother were called sons of thunder. They gave us a key to John's personality. Both brothers were characterized by zeal, passion, and ambition. And in his early days, John acted rashly, recklessly, impetuously, aggressively. Now, he even called Jesus to call down fire on the people, the Samaritans, because they refused to welcome Jesus. Now, that's how aggressive he is. Now, he was a fisherman. Most fishermen are uneducated, they're aggressive, they're like, maybe our construction worker, very cholo, that's the word in Hokkien, very rough. Yeah, so he had that kind of background. He's also the author of 5 books in the New Testament, right? Someone who is a fisherman, uneducated perhaps, wrote 5 books in the New Testament. He wrote the Gospel of John, the 3 epistles of John, and the book of Revelation. Well, according to Warren Wiersbe's book, the B series, he said that the Gospel of John, the main theme is to believe, as what John wrote in John chapter 20, verse 31. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. The epistles of John was about us being sure of our salvation. I write this thing to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, so that you may know that you have eternal life. And the book of Revelation is about being ready. It's to be ready for the coming of Christ. He who testifies to these things says, yes, I am coming soon. So John was the last remaining disciple of Jesus. I'm not sure whether that's a curse or that's a blessing. You know, your brother was killed before your eyes and all your colleagues were killed and you are left alone. Sometimes, you know, when you are left alone all by yourselves, you feel the emptiness in you. It's just something is being sucked out of you, you know. I don't know, maybe I would prefer to be the first one to be martyred and go to heaven and then enjoy my time in heaven. But John had that time when he had to remain on earth and he had to suffer persecution much longer than most of his friends did. Well, from fisherman to apostle, John's character has changed. He's been transformed from someone who's rough, someone who's aggressive. He then becomes someone who is loving. He cared for Jesus' mother as if she was his own mom. And his rash request for special honor had given way to compassion and humility. And he wrote in Revelation chapter 1, verse 9, your brother and companion in the suffering and the kingdom and patience, endurance that are ours in Jesus. He saw himself as one of us that we suffer, not someone who sat next to Jesus at the right hand of the throne of God, you know. So his mindset, well, like most of us, he's a flawed person. I think everybody in the Bible, except Jesus, of course, is a flawed person. And we have to see the authors from that perspective. We should not be worshiping the author of the Bible. We should honor them, but we should not worship them. The only person that we worship in the Bible is Jesus, who is the Son of God. He's sinless, and unlike us, we are all flawed. And John has many flaws, and I will bring that up as we progress in this lesson. He's also a committed friend. He was the only one who stood at the cross with Jesus and his mother. The rest scattered and were hiding from the crowd. And he had, of course, obviously he had some illusion of grandiosity. He wanted to be the one next to Jesus. If Jesus is number 1, I will be number 2, and my brother will be number 3. And also he was actually aggrieved towards the Romans. And the way he wrote about the book, the way he wrote to his disciples and the churches is actually writing about the Romans. And he wrote it in quotes so that the Roman who will deliver his letter on his behalf will not know that he was writing against the Caesar of the day, the Nero, and also Domitian. So I'm going to that in detail as we progress in this lesson. Well, he called himself the Apostle of Love. It's very interesting that he wrote about himself as someone who is an apostle of love. Um, he also wrote 5 times in the book of John that he is the apostle that Jesus loved. He was a disciple that Jesus loved. And so it's very interesting in the way he introduced himself. Where it was written, well, it was written in an island when he was banished in an island called Patmos. Patmos was outside of Asia Minor at that time. And so he was there in an island which is surrounded by sea. The sea were his prison bars. And every time he write about the sea in the book of Revelation, he wrote something, often use it in negative connotation because he is separated from everyone else by the seas. For instance, he saw his prison, the sea was his prison walls. If you're writing to me, there's a chat there. Okay. So again, he said, he called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the land and the sea. He also made reference to the sea. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea was turned into blood. It's obvious that, the way we think is often influenced by our environment. So his environment is that he lives in a cave, he's all by himself, and he's surrounded by sea. And more of this, he wrote that a third of living creature in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. So obviously he's making a very negative connotation about the sea whenever he wrote about it. So he lived in a cave. Today you go to Patmos Island, there is this remnants of the cave that he lived in. And this is like his home for years that from where he wrote the book of Revelation. So I, John, who also am your brother and companion in tribulation, was in an isle that is called Patmos for the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. So he was in Patmos. He wrote that he was in tribulation, right? Because he was isolated. He was suffering basically from loneliness. The worst kind of imprisonment is being confined to isolation. And that's terrible, because when you are confined all to yourself to just 4 walls with a little window and no interaction with others, you can go crazy like many did. So he was in that room that he wrote the book of Revelation. Solitary confinement is the most severe of all punishment. That's why he wrote that he was in tribulation. The Romans' intention to put John in that island was to rein in the spread of the gospel. But this was the last disciple of Jesus. If they thought that by putting John in that island all by himself, this new Christian believer will die a natural death. So instead of killing him, they just put him in an island all by himself, thinking that this new faith about this Jesus will just die a natural death. But actually, this putting him in the prison and his writing of John, of the book of John and all that, actually spread the gospel further than actually the Roman would have imagined. So from there, it has spread to all the world. Patmos actually means, the name of the island Patmos actually means my killing. They were trying to kill the gospel, but the gospel was spread instead. So in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, it says, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result." So whatever that we are going through now, it may seem bad, but God has a greater plan. There's something great can come out of this. And so rather than focusing on our pain, we need to focus on the purpose, perhaps, why God put us in this position right now. When it was written, well, it was written in 98 AD, after Jesus passed away. At that time, they had 2 emperors. Before that, before Domitian was Nero. As I mentioned earlier, Nero was a terrible emperor. He persecuted Christians, and he lead them, put them on the stick, place them on the street, and then burn them alive as street lamb. And that was how the Christians were persecuted. But Domitian was even worse than Nero. He was a cruel and paranoid tyrant. He's basically Nero 2.0. Nero was bad. This guy was worse, far worse. Now, this was a time when John was alive then, and he actually witnessed all this that was going on, and therefore he was concerned about the Christians, the faith were being shaken and being deceived by this man who claimed to be God, and also, that because he was persecuting the Christians so harshly, John was also concerned that some of them might actually give up their faith. This guy Domitian, you will not hear a lot of him because the Roman historian actually wipe out his history, because even the Romans hated him. He was anti-Christianity. He persecuted the Christians, and he also persecuted the actors and actresses for some reason. He's paranoid about them. And he called himself Lord and God. And this was one of the main reasons for the writing of the book of Revelation. As I mentioned earlier, he had this coin made, and this was the son, his son. And his son was sitting in a universe, as though to display that his own son was the son of God. He is God, and his son is the son of God, the son of the universe. And there are 7 stars that surrounded this son of his. So it's very evident that this guy, who is a mortal like all of us, perhaps, he was the emperor, but he deemed himself as God. And so he expect everybody to worship him. So there were temples that were built to worship Domitian. And he is a very superstitious man, so he has a raven, a bird that he would consult for prophecy and all that. So the story goes that one day he looked at the raven to foretell his immediate future, and the raven responded and said, "All will be well, all will be well." And soon after this, Domitian was murdered and all was well. Domitian's memory was condemned to oblivion by the Roman Senate. So his historian do not want his name to be written in the history of Rome and Italy, because he was a terrible, terrible emperor. And so we will hear of Nero for some reason, but even though he was bad, we will hear of Nero in the history book, but we will not hear of much of Domitian. But historian has dug up some of this, and it's very interesting that he was reigning Rome during the time John was in prison. And I'm putting the two together to see, hopefully we can see the reason behind the writing of his letters to the 7 churches. His Domitian legacy came to an end while trying to predict his own future and living in a luxurious palace. You think that he could continue to be God, and there's the temples in his name. Even when he passed on, people continue to worship him. But because of the hatred felt for Domitian, his images, many of which were of silver and many of gold, were melted down after he died. John's legacy, on the other hand, and his foretelling of the future goes on despite being banished to live in an isolated island. You can see the difference. One living in the luxurious palace and claiming himself to be God, and he has servants, he snapped his fingers, servants to serve him, hating that his legacy will continue. Whereas John was put in an isolated island all by himself, yet John's legacy continued much further than Domitian's legacy. So this is the irony. And, if God has set us to serve him, even though we may be small in what we are doing, we may not be seeing success in what we are doing now, you never know what's going to happen after we pass on. Our legacy can go far and wide. The Romans were then seen as the most powerful empire militarily and economically, and it was against this backdrop that John wrote the book of Revelation. He was 92 years old when he wrote this. So, we are not done until God is done. So let's continue to and be faithful in what we do. Don't look at what we have now and think that there's little, there's nothing. John had nothing. All he had was himself. He couldn't see anybody, outside of the island, and yet his legacy continues. Why he wrote this book? Well, the word revelation means unveiling, to unveil, the prophecy of God, and to unveil the coming of Christ, and who we know we'll be returning to this world. You know, when we fight in a war, there are two perspectives that we can fight from. Number one, we can fight from an infantry perspective. The people on the ground, they can fight from the ground level, what they saw the war from that ground level perspective. So I'm glad that I'm not an infantry soldier when I was army in Singapore. When I was serving in the national service, I was in the Air Force. You know, though I applied to be an Air Force pilot, I didn't get to pass the cadet. They actually ejected me, not rejected me because of my height. And so, you know, when you fight from the elevation perspective, you can see more. So you can see from the people's, in warfare, you can see from the people's perspective, or we can see from God's perspective, from up above. And this was the reason why this book was written, so that we don't see the world that's going on now in the future from our perspective, but from God's perspective. And Isaiah 40 verse 22 says, God sits above the circle of the earth. The people below seem like grasshoppers to him. So, hey, you remember the 12, the 12 spies that were sent to the promised land? 10 saw themselves as grasshoppers. 2 saw themselves as, hey, God is more powerful than them. So if we see from God's perspective, here in Isaiah, he says, God sits at the circle of the earth. The people below seem like grasshoppers. So if we see our enemy, what we are going through, from God's perspective, everything seems small, because we are seeing it from the elevated perspective. And so when we see that from the book of Revelation, it gives us that elevated perspective of what is to come. And he points the 7 churches to their current condition, what is happening to them now, and what's awaiting them in the future if they do not do any changes towards what's happening. I like this quote. It says, where there is no faith in the future, there is no power in the present. So if you don't see the future, if you don't know what's going on in the future, and you see that the future is hopeless, then our life right now in the present is hopeless too. And so we need to see in the future that God is coming back soon. We have already won the victory. We don't fight for victory, we fight from victory, and therefore we can live in victory right now. See, this church, a beautiful church, was abandoned, and today is looking this way because they did not heed the call of what is coming. And so as church pastors, we need to be aware that, hey, there's going to be an attack on the churches. The cultural revolution is going to change what the church is supposed to be and all that. So in Europe, you see beautiful buildings, church buildings like this. You know, it used to house churches, but today this church, with this beautiful building, this beautiful sanctuary, is changed into a skateboard park because there isn't enough members to maintain the church. And so the church is now a skateboard park, and also the painting on the mural on the wall and the ceiling of that of a skull is no longer something that is godly, but something that's been overtaken by the enemy. This used to be a church sanctuary, today is a pub, it's a restaurant. So if we don't take heed about the warning for us as Christians and for the churches, one day we may not have a church. So this church here, beautiful building at the bottom right, is now converted into a hotel. No more worshiping of God in this. And that was the reason why Book of Revelation was written, to warn us that if we of our current situation, and if we don't make any changes, then we might not see a future in what we are doing. So look up, get ready, because he's coming again soon. Now, how it was written? Well, it was written in symbols that was pretty obvious to the people then. If you are a Christian, a Hebrew, a Jew, then you will understand the codes that John would have written. Now, he wrote specifically to the Christians about the Roman Empire. There was a fake God, someone who claimed to be God, someone who claimed to be the Son of God, someone who claimed to be the ruler of the world. Just John is telling them, hey, hold fast. Don't be swayed by this person. Don't be swayed by what's going on in your culture, in your life, in the cities that you live in, but be steadfast. know that our God is coming back for you. This is not the real God. So he wrote about the Roman Empire, obviously in fear that these letters that were written, that was being sent by the postman, will be read by the Romans. And so he wrote in quotes so that the Romans would not understand what he was writing. Obviously, the Roman think that he was just writing a religious letter, encouraging them to stand steadfast, but instead, but actually he was writing about the Roman Empire. So if we show someone from the past, for instance, you bring someone during the time of Jesus and the time of John, and show them all these quotes and icons, they would be thinking, what are these? They don't understand this, but we understand this. These are all icons of the today's social media world. We understand most of it, but if we show it to the people back in the time of John, they will not understand this. It's the same thing. If they were to show us their quotes, we may not understand what they were trying to say, even though it was very obvious to them. For instance, 666 and even the mark of the beast were very obvious to the people of the seven churches, and I'm going to show you today. Now, maybe John had a revelation about the beast, or that something that's coming from the sky, because probably he has this vision of this plane releasing these flares. I'm not sure you see that there's an angel that comes, image of the angel that follows through those flares. I don't know, I'm just speculating. Maybe this was what he saw. He, the beast, did astounding miracles, even making fire flashes down to earth from the sky while everyone was watching. Was he looking at this? I don't know. We only know when we all go to heaven. Everybody will know the exact truth of the Bible only when we get to heaven. A lot of time, if we're just using our intellectual, spiritual, perhaps theological minds to understand the scripture. So it was an impression of the future in which John don't quite understand. Now there's two parts in the book of Revelation. I must qualify myself. The first three chapters were about the seven churches of their current plight, and if you don't do anything about the situation, then the church might be destroyed, their faith might be destroyed. So he was warning them to do something. Then the second part, he actually went into a state where he went into heaven and he saw what's on the other side. So that's a bit more challenging to interpret, because he felt he has called into the other side, and he went into heaven, the throne room of God, where he saw angels worshiping and singing holy, holy, and holy. And next week, if we continue in this, hopefully we can continue in this series, we're going to look into all this from the holistic perspective again and see what it meant. Okay, now the revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servant what must soon take place, he made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. So he write that he was alone again, in that time when he was alone, he felt God speaking to him, and there was an angel that came and sent these messages to him and then through him. Now I want you to read this word soon. He said, what must soon take place? I'm not sure about your understanding of soon. My soon is like tomorrow, next week, perhaps. Soon, maybe next month. But when he wrote that it must happen soon, it has been 2,000 years since he wrote. So the soon has not happened yet. Maybe it's already progressively happening. But in his mind, when he wrote it, he assumed that it will happen in his lifetime. So it must happen soon. So has he assumed that it happened in his lifetime? It must happen soon. And John will maybe assuming that it will happen during his lifetime. He will see all these things. But God's timing is not our timing. And so we just got to believe that God is coming back, and we just got to look up for all these signs. And it is important to note John's mental and emotional condition and how it may have influenced his writings. As such, he may have interpreted the vision from that standpoint, because firstly, he was alone. He was perhaps aggrieved towards the Romans because his own brothers and his colleagues were tortured and were killed by the Romans. And so he was writing to his disciples to warn them about the Romans, and he was aggrieved towards them. So the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Now, 70 AD, John was still alive. He actually witnessed that. And can you imagine, as a Jew, your temple, the hub of activity in your spiritual life, is being destroyed by the Roman Empire? It's something that they hold in deeply. and they were persecuted as well. His own personal struggle because he was lonely, and the churches were struggling as well. So he, more than just his own personal struggle, being banished in an island all by himself, he's also concerned about the churches that were struggling as a result of what's going on. So he has this challenge in his mindset. Now, as a psychologist, I look into all this from a psychological perspective because I see these authors from the Bible as mere mortals like you and I, just like pastors preaching the sermon, they speak it from their own perspective. And so they may have been inspired by God to preach that message, but it's the personality that comes from. And John has that personality that he comes from. He wrote it as a quote to warn the Christians against actually the Roman Empire. One of the books that I actually researched on to prepare this lesson is this book by Elaine Pages. She's a professor in religion, and she wrote this book about Revelation from the academic perspective and the academician perspective as well as a historian perspective. So these historians, these academicians actually dig into more history than we Christians did. And so when they look into a culture and the history of certain cities and countries, they would dig deep into their culture and understand what it was. Now, she wrote that actually the book, the number 666 that appear in the book of Revelation is, she's a professor of religion at Princeton University. And she's best known for her studies and writing on the Gnostic gospel. And she wrote about the meaning of 666. And the academician, the historian, actually found that the Greek spelling for Nero Caesar is actually a transliterated form from the Hebrew word that equals 666. So if you are a Hebrew, if you write in Hebrew language about Nero Caesar, it's almost like the number 666. For instance, the Chinese are very superstitious. So they don't like the number 4, say, that means die, say, die. So they, they have this meaning behind it. And so there's this quote when he wrote about 666, perhaps John was targeting the Caesar at the time, both Nero and Domitian. And so the person who is antichrist, and these two were antichrist because they were persecuting the Christians then. And so when he wrote, look out for the 666. He was telling the people, the Christians then, look out for the Nero, Caesar, both either Nero and now Domitian. Look out for them. They are the Antichrist. And so actually, the Antichrist has always been there. He's always been around. And throughout history, there's so many of these antichrists. As Christians, we need to know who they are so that we know how to deal with them, and not look for that one person that we possibly been taught that he's going to come and appear and as whatever form that he was. But when John wrote, he wrote it as a quote. 666 actually is a Hebrew word that equals Nero Caesar. The 666 was already there in their midst. Just as I believe right now 666 is, if we use this code 666, is appearing, it's everywhere. There are anti-Christians everywhere. It's more evident now. There are people who are actually very anti-Christians, and Christianity has been persecuted. As long as they're being persecuted, these are the antichrists. And so Nero was a known terrorist in John's time. He was terrible. He burned the Christians alive and put them on a stake and then lit them out in the street. And in terms of terrorists, he's worse than those terrorists that we know of today. So possibly Nero's code was used to describe a man of similar traits. So my understanding is that when he wrote this 666, we need to understand that there are many other 666 that are around. We just need to live our lives to be wary. So throughout history, we were looking for people to be that 666. Perhaps there was once Hitler was known as the 666, and then Gorbachev was also the 666 because he has the mark on his forehead. And then some people, said that this guy Obama was the 666, and some people said this. I think it's Bagadel. His name is Bagadel or something like that. It was a 666. There are many references to all these things, but we just got to be careful that we just need to know that there are people who are actually opposing us as Christians in our lifestyle, in our beliefs, and there are people who actually been persecuted today because of that. And using quote John's quote, these are the 666 people. So it was used as a reference rather than as a person. To continue this book, if you can get this book, is available on Amazon.com. Now, Dr. Elaine Page's, I don't think she's a Christian, but she's a historian. She's a professor of history and in Princeton University. So she dig more into the history than we as Christians actually did, because all we read is just the pages from the Bible. These historians actually dig deep into it. So when they dug into it, I make my reference to it, and so putting everything together to have this study in this learning year. So now let's look at the mark of the beast. The Romans actually used imperial stamp on official documents, and also used tattoos to authorize people to engage in Romans business. So in cities that were colonized by the Romans, the people who are being colonized, if they want to do business with a Roman, they must have that stamp, they must have that tattoo, that they accepted what the Romans as their leader, as their god or whatever. So once they have the tattoo, then they can conduct business with the Roman Empire, with the Romans people per se. So if you don't have that mark, then you are not allowed to engage in business with the Romans. And so the Romans were very fond of tattoos. So the Roman soldiers admire tattoos. At the beginning, they started painting the symbol SPQR on the shoulder for soldiers. SPQR means Senatus Populus Quae Romanus. It means the Senate and the Roman people. Now, the prisoners, slaves, had their foot painted in white, and gladiators were also tattooed, while defeated soldiers had a small crown tattooed on them. So actually, the Romans were seen. Now remember, John was aggrieved towards the Romans. Firstly, the emperor were persecuting Christians like crazy. His own brother was killed savagely by the Romans, and the Christians were burned alive and all that. Now he used the quote 666 to reference to the Romans, especially the emperors. Then he referenced the mark of the beast, that, hey, don't you get this mark of the beast, that you become identified with the Romans. Stand firm. Don't get yourself be marked out by the beast. So according to Dr. Elaine Pages, these were actually very common during the time that people who want to trade with the Romans will have to surrender their lives to the Romans, and that they have the tattoo in them, that there's so much that they have been traded into the Roman lifestyle and the Roman empire system, and so much so that they can actually do business with them. So it's more for economic reason as well as military reason that they have these tattoos. And these tattoos, as far as I'm concerned, as far as what the historian has have written and discovered, this mark could just be the tattoos that the Romans were very fond of putting onto themselves or the prisoners or the slaves. The seven churches, well, these seven churches, John, when he wrote in the first 3 chapters, he wrote specifically to the 7 churches. God gave him the impression of what's going on. Remember, he was marooned in an island. He was stranded in an island. He did not know what was going on in that city, but God gave him that picture of what's going on. For instance, the people in Ephesus, they were too busy, and that their busy lifestyle impede their faith in God, and so he was writing to them. He didn't have the intention to write to us people in the 21st century. He was writing specifically to the people of the 7 churches. Perhaps these 7 churches represent the 7 kind of Christians that are evident in today's world. So we can contextualize it. We can still apply lessons, even though it was not written specifically for us and to us, but we can still apply lessons from it today by contextualizing what was written. So in this book, he wrote about the Antichrist, the Battle of Armageddon, the dreaded foe, horsemen of the apocalypse, the beast of 666, and all that. And I'm going to share with you what was written and how I then interpret between the scripture and the academician and what their impression of the book of Revelation is all about. So according to Dr. Elaine Pages, she said this book is the hardest one in the Bible to understand. I don't think anyone completely understand it. Neither am I. I think we can only understand it fully when we all go to heaven and see God and see what's going on for ourselves. We may not have a lot of agreement in all that I shared, but a few things that we need to agree upon. Number one, Jesus is the Son of God. As Christians, we need to acknowledge that he was crucified, he resurrected after 3 days, he is coming back again. In this world, we will have tribulations, we will have troubles. Right now, the world is going through. So these are some of the point of agreement, some of the things that I shared. You may not agree with it, but we can agree on this point of agreement. So don't throw stone at me as yet. I'm going to show you a lot of documentary proof about what's going on in the time of John when he wrote the book of Revelation. So I'm going to finish this at 11, so I have 10 more minutes or 5 more minutes, and I'm just going to quickly go into chapter 1, and then tomorrow we'll start with the book, with the first church called the church in Ephesus. Now, it was the Lord's Day. That means it was Sunday, the worship day, that whichever day that we call to worship. Maybe to them it's a Saturday. It was the Lord's Day, and I was worshiping in the Spirit. He was alone, and it was Sunday. He was worshiping. Right now, today, the church the people have left the church building. Now we are all worshiping respectively in our home, and John is doing that. So he was basically locked down like some of us are. So he was worshiping even in spite of the fact that he was being locked down. We can do the same, perhaps. He said, suddenly I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet blast. He said, what's the Lord's Day? And suddenly, now, he didn't have time to do research like I did. I did spend a lot of time in reading and discovering from other sources about, not just from the commentaries, Christian commentators about Revelation. I'm trying to get information from the historians as well, and the people who actually the Roman history as well, to try and find out what this is all about. But John didn't have that privilege that I did. He didn't have google.com like we have now. Now it seems like he was worshiping, and suddenly, let me say, have no time to actually do his research. So suddenly it was called the angel. There was a loud trumpet blast. It says, write in a book everything you see and send it to the 7 churches in the cities of Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. It was inferred as a spontaneous writing with no time for research. So he was like, suddenly he has this impression, this vision, and this thing that he began to write about. Okay, Ephesians, this is what I have against you. And he was writing towards them. And everything he wrote was spot on. I'm going to show you the discovery of the cities through the archaeological discoveries. The cities, everything that John wrote to the city was actually spot on. Now, this was in spite of the fact that he was stranded in an island. He wasn't in the city, but he wrote everything that he wrote about the city was spot on from the historian and the archaeological perspective. So when I turned to see who was speaking to me at the time, I saw 7 gold lampstands. And the lampstand, in the middle of the lampstand was someone like the Son of Man. He was wearing a long robe with a gold sash across his chest. His head and his hair were like white, like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like flames of fire. You know, every time you see a poster painting of Jesus, we see that, whoo, his eyes is so mesmerizing. But John's writing, the eyes of God is like fire. It's not as mesmerizing as this image here. I'm going to continue with this tomorrow, but I'm going to go on. And again, he says, he has 7 stars in his right hand. 7 stars, remember 7 stars, yeah? And a sharp 2-edged sword came from his mouth, and his face was like the sun in all its brilliance. 7 stars, well, referenced 4 times in his writing, and 7 means complete. And remember Domitian, he reigned from 81 to 96. At the time, John was still alive. And he has this coin made of his son to be the Son of God, and he's God, and he has these 7 stars that surround him. So it's this reference. Now here's another coin in the time of Domitian. Domitian, the coin, his face was on the left, and on the flip side of the coin was this beast, and children or people were milking from this beast, this unidentified beast. Remember, that's a beast that he was talking about. Could he be making reference to this? This was during his time. And early on, I showed you this picture of Domitian. On one side of the coin, it was his image, and the other side of the coin, he was riding a great white horse. And these are the history of the Roman statements and historian of Greek origin, the commentary on the 53rd book of Theos Cassius, Roman history. I would make reference to this tomorrow, but I want to just start off with Ephesians, just to give you a bit of what we're going to cover tomorrow, and then we will continue. So Ephesians was the first church. Now, when he wrote to this church, the 7 churches were actually written not because of their importance, but because on the way the mailman will run, the postman will run. Because Ephesus was a closer city to Patmos, then the mailman who pick up the letters from John will first go to Ephesus, then he will go to Smyrna, then will go to Pergamon, then Thyatira, Sardis, then to Philadelphia, then to Colossae, then back to Patmos. There were 7 lampstands, 7 churches. Perhaps during the time the world was dark, the Christian world was dark because there was a lot of persecution. Perhaps these 7 churches need to be the light to light up the world in the time of darkness. So John had this impression about them. So John wrote to the people of Ephesus, and then I close with this. He says, write this letter to the angel of the church in Ephesus. This is the message from the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, the one who walks among the 7 gold lampstands. Now, let me give you the first thing about Ephesus. Remember, we dig into history. Remember the coins and the dollar note will tell you what's going on in the city. So in Singapore, we talk about the culture. These are all the culture that's represented in Singapore. Now, the coin, Ephesus city profile, the coin of the day was the mascot. The mascot is a bee. Historians actually found these coins, and it is from the city of Ephesus. Now, what does B stand for? We call people busy as a bee. And the church in Ephesus was a busy church. Now, when John was writing, I'm not sure whether he has opportunity to look into the coins, the history, the facts, what's going on, but he wrote to them and tell them that, hey, you've been too busy, you lost your first love and all that. But the mascot in the coin, the image in the coin was that of a busy bee. So I want to just end. I don't want to take too much of your time. It's 11 o'clock. I promise that we finish at 11 o'clock. Tomorrow I'll continue with this. You hold on your questions. If you have any questions on Friday, we'll finish this and we will then try and answer you all the questions. All right, I have a favor. If you think that you want to help, I'm sorry. Yeah. So you can support this course to provide more online lessons for free so I can continue to do this. You want to contribute to this, any amount is fine. Go to paypal.com and then you can make your send your donation to fredtoke@lee.edu.sg. Right? This lesson is free. I want to provide it free for everybody, but if you can help us to continue to provide these online lessons, any offering, any amount is good for me. Thank you so much. Now, again, my lesson comes from the holistic perspective. It's not just spiritual perspective. I'm coming from the historian, academician, archaeological, as well as psychological perspective of this lesson, so that you can see it from that holistic perspective. And that may also demystify the writings of John in the book of Revelation. So tomorrow we'll go in depth in the book of in the churches in Ephesus, as well as in the church in Smyrna. Very interesting for us to look into the history and why John actually wrote to it. So thank you all, and I will be sending you the link this evening where you can view this lesson. So thank you. God bless. See you tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Okay, we have 1 hour, tomorrow 10 o'clock.